Which nation has a GDP of over $2 trillion, outranks all of the other nations in the world in terms of economy except for 6, and only has a population of 39.54 million people? Well, let me tell you something, it ain't no nation. It is the state of California. Yep, if the state of California were a country, it would be pretty well off. This, combined with some recent calls for independence that no one really takes seriously, brings to mind a fundamental question. What if California was actually a separate nation and never part of the United States? How would history be different? First, the facts. During the Bear Flag Revolt from June to July 1846, a small group of American settlers in California rebelled against the Mexican government and proclaimed California an independent republic. The political situation in California was tense in 1846. Though it was controlled by Mexico, California was home to a growing population of American settlers. Mexican leaders worried that many of these settlers were not truly interested in becoming Mexican subjects and would soon push for annexation of California to the United States. Well, they were right. For their part, the Americans distrusted the Mexican leaders. When rumors of an impending war between the United States and Mexico reached California, many Americans feared that they might be attacked by the Mexicans. So the California Republic was short-lived because soon after the Bear Flag was raised, the U.S. military began occupying California, which went on to join the Union in 1850. Yeah, so basically, the independent California Republic technically only lasted for about 25 days, and all of the leaders of the revolt, including John C. Fremont, only wanted to join the U.S. They had no wish to remain an independent nation. Even a Mexican general in the region, named Vallejo, wanted California to be annexed by the U.S. Yeah, so this timeline is pretty much impossible. So the only way such a scenario with an independent California would succeed is if the Californios take a bigger stance in the revolution. Who were these Californios? A Californio was a Spanish-speaking Catholic person of Latin American descent, born in the Mexican state of Alta California between 1769 and 1848. So Alta California is the area that roughly corresponds to modern-day California. And it was actually pretty much about twice the size of modern-day California as well. The Californios were not as adamant about joining the U.S. as the American settlers were. They were inclined to join the U.S., of course, but there was also the option of remaining independent for them. They also debated during 1845 whether they should be annexed by Britain or even France. The issue is that they basically surrendered without a shot during the Bear Flag Revolt in most cases to the Americans. And the American settlers were easily able to sweep up California. Most Californios, to put it simply, did not put up an active resistance to Americans who were fighting them. So let's say that in this alternate timeline, the Californios organized into actual groups of fighting men and drive out the Americans. Especially when they drive out the Americans, they would still have to drive out the American military, which would likely be next to impossible due to the sheer odds against them. So let's say that they win. The best case scenario, 99% impossible. What would happen next? Well, the Americans would not give up easily, that's for sure. They would defeat the rest of Mexico in the Mexican-American War. Yet the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo signed at the end of the war will be altered so that California, the giant state of Alta California, not just today's California, would be intact and independent. Now, this would not last long by itself, since the state of Alta California was thinly populated and vulnerable to attack. The only way I see California surviving is if Great Britain intervenes. Now, Great Britain and the U.S. were not on the best of terms at the time. They had recently had a dispute over Oregon territory, with President James K. Polk even threatening to go to war over the region. So Britain would not be in the best of moods. Now, if Britain were to actively prop up the floundering nation of California, there is a slight chance that it might survive. Then comes the gold rush. Now, the gold rush may not come in 1848 as it did in our timeline, but eventually, some random guy in some random place will find gold in the ground. A virtual flood of Americans will result, and unless California has a pretty big border controls in place, they will be swamped. I see the territory of California being reduced substantially in this period of intense American immigration, as the American government kind of bullies the weak nation and forces California to sign a treaty ceding about half of the territory that they have. Now, California is about the size of the modern state of California after ceding all that territory, and it will be surrounded on both sides by Mexican and American territory. Mexico will likely also make attempts to reconquer its lost state, and if bearing a miracle California survives, it would have to contend with much more powerful nations for its entire existence. The gold rush eventually draws many immigrants from other parts of the world, which includes China, and all those Chinese immigrants greatly boost the labor force of California. Since California is more open to immigrants in this timeline, and not subject to the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, the Chinese population is enormous in this timeline. Essentially, half of the population of the state would be Chinese, and the rest a mix of Anglo and Hispanic settlers. This influx of labor would boost California to the top of the Latin American nations, and by the mid-20th century, it is self-sufficient. Its Pacific ports carry goods from all over the world, and with well-established borders, neither America nor Mexico attempts to attack it. In World War II, since America had placed its Pacific fleet in California in our original timeline, such an act will not be possible, and America would have to place its Pacific fleet in Pearl Harbor, if it has a fleet at all. Also, California will likely stay neutral during the war, pledging no allegiance to either side, although a Japanese invasion is highly likely. Since California is not as strong as it was under the protection of the U.S., the Japanese conquered California and set up a puppet state like Manchukuo on the border of the U.S. This could also result in actual land fighting between Americans and the Japanese on the American homeland, and although the Americans would win, it would be a great shock to American prestige and power. America, of course, would be much less of a role player in terms of culture and power in this timeline. California, with Hollywood and the cultural invention it fostered, really boosted America in the modern world. Without such a key region, America doesn't really pose as great of a threat to Japan. Also, since its Pacific fleet is weaker, Japan never really bothers to attack Pearl Harbor, and the U.S. never joins the war. However, the Soviets will be more than enough to defeat the Axis powers, and thus the Axis powers will still lose if Hitler makes the dumb mistake of attacking the Soviet Union. However, the Japanese and Soviets will likely make peace with one another, with Japan in a much more powerful situation than in our timeline. Japan will also likely have conquered Hawaii in this timeline, with America cut off from it by an occupied California. In this world, a Japanese empire dominates the Pacific, while the Soviets dominate in Europe. The Cold War that follows will be between the Soviets and the Japanese, and it's likely that one of the powers will eventually develop nuclear weapons. So that's my take on the topic. Say what you think will happen if California remained independent down in the comments below. This is Call of the World, signing out.